The Mindful Medic podcast is proudly sponsored by the Medical Benevolent Association of New South Wales, ACT. The MBA is an independent charity that has been supporting doctors in New South Wales and the ACT since 1896. They provide specialised counselling, information, referral and financial assistance to doctors and their families during times of adversity or hardship. Their aim is to provide non-judgmental support so that the doctor or family member recovers their well-being and independence and, wherever possible, returns to their vocation. Their services are free, specialised and no referral is necessary. All contact is kept strictly confidential and they are independent of any regulatory body. Hello and a very warm welcome back to the podcast. I am your host, Cheryl Martin. I'm an emergency doctor, avid runner, yoga teacher, eternal student, and my mind is full. In this podcast, we have been exploring broader paradigms of what it means to have good health, well-being, and to perform at our best. I've been really fortunate to meet some people who certainly inspire me, and I know that they'll inspire you too. I want to take an opportunity to thank everyone who's taken time to give me some constructive feedback on this little passion project and space that I've been growing. I'd really ask you to keep that coming. I've had a few suggestions of things that you'd like to see as topics of future focus and discussion. So please, if you get a chance, drop me a line and give me some good feedback. We talk a bit about feedback in this podcast, so please, very welcome. Just before we get into today's episode and I introduce our very special guest who I'm really delighted to have had the opportunity to speak to, I wanted to touch on a couple of things that have happened over the past fortnight that have really stopped me in my tracks, maybe even taken my breath away. So a bit later than it was aired, I downloaded the Cathy Freeman documentary on ABC iView. And if you haven't had a chance to download that, I really recommend it. I thought it was a very well produced piece. I really, got behind the mindset, the woman behind this phenomenal athlete. And it really took me back to that sublime moment of victory and real feat of human performance when she attained Olympic gold. And we're talking a wee bit today about the kind of road to mastery. And that moment, when she describes it herself, it was undoubtedly a state of flow that she attained. She just was completely focused. She had this sense of timelessness and the concentration, so focused on the task at hand, knowing that her skills aligned with that, and that degree of challenge versus skill, just the right mix, and passion and purpose intersecting. I think it's a real thing of beauty, and it makes me wonder at these kind of feats of human performance. But I think also the documentary goes into the highs and lows and the process towards any kind of expertise in any field. This is relevant, and there's so many parallels, and we talk about that in the podcast today. The other thing that I read was something on there's a social media page called Humans in Melbourne, which I think is an offshoot of Humans in New York. And I came across a picture of a man called Ben, and he seemed to be standing in some factory with a mask on. There was a bit of commentary from the man himself. And it turns out that Ben is a Qantas pilot of 20 years duration, and his partner is also an air stewardess with Qantas, and they have a young family. And both of them lost their jobs in March of this year during the pandemic. And he talks about being fearful for the future, but quite a few companies had approached Qantas and other airlines with employment opportunities for their staff. And an opportunity came up, and opportunity is the word that he uses at Amazon. And he said, I figured Amazon was a place where I could learn a lot, and I'd also be able to provide for my family. So I jumped at the chance to take a job there. And he became what's known as a picker. So this is why you see him in the factory. And his job was to pick the products that then would be given to the packers, who would then process them for delivery. And he talks about this experience. And, initially he said, I hadn't even put together a resume in 20 years, and I hadn't been for an interview. And so this was all very new. So well out of his comfort zone. But he really embraced the opportunity, and he said he was very embarrassed that he was made the Employee of the Month in May. And apparently Alan Joyce, the CEO of the Qantas Group, talked about this, much to his mortification, in the local town hall. He also pointed out that he was very impressed by the mentoring culture and the value of teamwork at Amazon, and he likened it very much to his work environment at Qantas, and one that he couldn't wait to return to. And I found the whole post just very inspiring, because somebody who quite clearly could be, understandably wallowing in a lot of self-pity and, a really awful situation to find yourself in. And I know many people will be touched by this post because they've also had their lives turned upside down. But instead he decided to embrace every opportunity and to find the positives wherever he could. And my message to Ben is, well, thank you for, I think he probably lifted quite a few people with this very powerful discourse. But also, I really hope that I am on your plane, and I would love if we could go to Glasgow and pick up my parents and bring them home to Melbourne, because I agree, there's no place quite like home. And just finally, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the legend that we lost this week in Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The positive mark that she left on the world and her legacy will certainly live on. It's been a celebration of all that she achieved in her life, and of the things that she did and said in media and other platforms over the past week. Something particularly that she is reported to have said really stood out for me, and I think feeds into today's episode. I would like to be remembered as someone who used whatever talent she had to do her work to the very best of her ability. I think we can quite confidently say that Justice Ginsburg certainly lived up to her own expectations.
It's being able to be in the moment with stuff like that and really appreciate it, to be undistracted, that's an example of good health. Because when you're not healthy, you can't appreciate those moments. And life's too short, and those moments are gone. So those spots of life, I guess, if someone was making a cheesy movie and you were looking back at all those precious moments you spent with someone, it would be those scenes that you would select for that montage. We should look out for those spots of life and appreciate them before they're gone.
That was Dr Cliff Reid. Dr Reid is a consultant in emergency medicine, pre-hospital and retrieval medicine and intensive care. He currently holds a senior staff specialist role in emergency medicine in Sydney. He's also the Director of Emergency Medicine Training at the New South Wales Air Ambulance Service. In addition to juggling these various roles and responsibilities, Cliff is probably most famous, certainly over the past decade, as a prominent medical educator who particularly emphasises the broader aspects of performance and training, or the art of practice, if you like, and what it takes to become an expert and that continuing journey to mastery in medicine. In this conversation, we cover his own professional journey to date, his mission as both a physician and educator, and really delve into some of the facets of the art of practice. We talk about leadership, the key role of culture, what it takes to be a lifelong learner, and he shares some really practical pearls for maintaining professional longevity. I'm delighted to say I also replenish my book list. And I feel that clinicians and non-clinicians will find something valuable in this conversation. I dare you to listen and not be inspired, or at the very least have the urge to tickle or be tickled. Enjoy this conversation. Hi Cliff, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for carving out some time in your busy week to talk to me today. I really wish we were connecting in person and not through this medium, and preferably in some exotic place around the world, but I think we're all getting very familiar with communicating this way. So you first inspired me well over a decade ago now, when I found you through, this was well in the days before Twitter and the rise of free online access to medical education. There was a UK-based doctors forum, doctors.net UK, where I came across you sharing knowledge, expertise, and really encouraging doctors to ask questions about their practice and their performance. And then when I returned to Australia, I found out that you were running courses through Resus Me at Basingstoke. And I signed up for all of those 3 early courses in emergency medicine and critical care. And for me, it really set perfect foundations for my advanced training. I later attended your Essence of Emergency Medicine and Making Things Happen course just as I became a specialist. And since then, you've gone on to encourage and inspire and nurture minds of doctors in training, I think indeed at all stages of the career across the world, and established yourself as one of the most prominent med educators in our time. And you particularly add value in the art of practice. I really feel that soft skills should not be called soft, but leadership, communication, I know you like to call it verbal jiu-jitsu, metacognition, mindfulness and mastery. And I wanted to have you on because this podcast has a strong performance focus, but also probably because I'm at a stage of my own practice where, I probably need some re-inspiration, and, questions of longevity of practice and how you maintain skills and expertise have really been quite prominent in my mind now 5 or 6 years post-fellowship. So you have said that your mission in life is to save life and inspire and train others to do so. Can you recall when this became your mission? And is this something you revise, reaffirm and revisit on a regular basis?
I think it boils down to my dad dying suddenly when I was at medical school. I was just in the second year, and he died of heart disease in his own bed on the first day of what was going to be his retirement. And he was only 57, and he knew he had heart disease, and so he sold his business and moved down to the coasts, and they hadn't even unpacked. He was tired after the move, went to bed, told my mum, yeah, we'll unpack in the morning. And he didn't wake up. And she tried CPR on him. Paramedics came, defibrillated him a few times, and then declared him dead. And that was a bit of a shock. And it seemed a bit unnecessary for someone that young to die and to be deprived of their retirement when he worked hard his whole life. So I took a few lessons from that. One of them being...
Were you a medical student at that time?
Yeah, I was in the second year at medical school, and we just started to learn cardiovascular pathology that day. There was a few lessons. Like first lesson I took from it was not really holding out for any kind of retirement. That seems to be flawed thinking. To look forward to when you're either too old or too sick to enjoy life, to start enjoying life. So I kind of live for the day. Ever since then, I've considered that each day might be my last day, and the way I interact with people and think about things is really influenced by that thought, really, by that understanding. And I didn't want that to happen to other families on my watch. I thought I should learn how to save lives as best I can. And so went into emergency medicine, and then really got blown away as a junior registrar teaching residents, or SHOs back then in the UK, teaching them what I knew and then watching them apply it as well as I could do it, or sometimes better, thinking that's really cool. If I teach other people stuff that I'm learning, that will save more lives. If they teach other people what I've taught them, then there's an exponential sort of ripple effect. So I can make a much bigger difference. So that's where my passion for education came from.
So you mentioned this was after you qualified. I'm interested to know what your undergraduate experience was like as a medical student, and if you had any, either positive or negative experiences of your education and training at that point that maybe influenced you further down the track?
At medical school, I got some great friends who shared an interest in martial arts and wacky humor and not working very hard. So the first lesson of my dad's death, living for the day and having fun, that was really the one I put into action the soonest. I certainly wasn't saving any lives as a medical student. And I really didn't work very hard, to the point where I was actually, it wasn't second year, it was the first year of medical school. That's right. And then we had the end of first year exams, which was just after my dad died, and I failed those. And they said, you've got to repeat the first year. And I said, I really don't want to. Can you just let me through? So they kind of let me through. And then I kept failing exams. Like there were assessments, they weren't exams as such, but I kept failing those throughout the second year because I was just having too much fun and doing too much kung fu. And then I was up before the sub-dean again, and worked really hard and managed to get through the important exams that got me through to the next year. But I kind of went a little bit off the rails, living life for the day, literally, and was, just with friends for life that are still great friends. And I don't regret a second of that. We did a lot of kung fu, and we had a lot of fun, and we had a lot of laughs. And it was funny because people used to assume we were on drugs, but I never did an illicit drug my whole time at university, and hardly drank any alcohol. We just didn't need to. We were just finding everything funny as it was. It was kind of a nice state to be in, really.
I think we have to give Dr. James French a bit of a shout out there. You mentioned martial arts, and I think you're the first person that actually made me think that we should be training doctors like all performers or elite performers. Is there any influence in the training that you did through your martial arts that has influenced your practice and the way that you teach? It certainly seems that way to me, but I just wondered if it's something you were conscious of.
Yeah, I think there's been a number of phases I've gone through in my martial arts training, which probably have influenced the way I look at training in general. And one is in preparation for reality. So there are people that will get to quite high levels in different martial arts by passing all the assessments because they can do beautiful techniques, make it look good and do all the right things and pay the money and do the grading and get the belt. And some of those are great fighters too, but some of them will be unlucky enough to be in a real situation where they have to defend themselves. And when they are actually confronted by an angry, growling, large, menacing opponent trying to rip their head off, suddenly forget every technique they've ever learned. And there was a sort of renewed focus in the early 90s, or early to mid 90s, on more training for reality. Certainly in the UK, a guy called Jeff Thompson, who was a karate instructor who became a bouncer, became a doorman. And he wrote a book about his experiences because he was saying the first time he was in a real fight, despite being a black belt at karate, he said something along the lines of, suddenly 15 years of martial arts training fell out of the back seat of my underpants. And a lot of people found that. So there was this drive to actually train for reality using contact and using scenarios and simulations in realistic environments, rather than the sterile, matted environment of the dojo. You find a car park at night and get your training partners to jump out on you, and see how you would deal with that. And so that, I was doing that stuff before I was involved in any kind of medical simulation, but clearly there's an influence there that makes me want to simulate things and make things as realistic as possible and not make assumptions about how we will perform under pressure because we can do the technique or do the procedure.
Yeah, I think you were one of the first clinical teachers I had who really made me think about my cognitive performance and the human factors that were at play on the way I make decisions, the way I interact with patients and colleagues. I remember in the Making Things Happen course, you showed the monkey business illusion, and that's a really powerful example. I was clearly very task fixated there, and I didn't see the big hairy gorilla as I was counting the passes between the ball players. I know certainly prior to that, I was aware of the work of, very important work of Martin Bromley, and, taking his experience from the aviation industry, really being quite appalled and surprised that we had not been incorporating these things into training. Is this something that you were did you make a conscious transition to incorporate this into your own practice and education, and who mentored, inspired you, and made you, I suppose, ask more questions in this area quite early on in your career?
I've always been interested in resuscitation, and when I did pre-hospital care with London HEMS at the end of my emergency training, I was trained by people that were so good at making things happen and so good at controlling their environment, as well as controlling the patient and the team. And that made me really interested in those human factors and the psychological aspects of performance. And so I just started reading a lot about it, popular psychology books and so on. And there's some really good stuff out there. And the more you realize the perceptual and cognitive limitations that we've evolved to have, the more you understand how those are exploited. And you need to develop mechanisms to protect yourselves against them. I mean, there are whole books on the neuroscience of magic and how magicians are able to do seemingly impossible things just by exploiting our perceptual limitations. That stuff is so fascinating, and the did you see the gorilla thing that a lot of people will be familiar with now? That's a great example of that inattention that you have to the surrounds when you're focused on one particular task, and that gets people killed either from not paying attention to scene safety, or getting the patient killed because you're not noticing a desaturation because you're task fixated on an intubation, for example.
So I'm going to put some links in the show notes to your smack talks on advice to a young resuscitationist and making things happen in emergency medicine, because I think these are important listening for trainees. I was actually Googling the links, and I assume that you know this, that when you Google Cliff Reid, you are actually a famous film producer. I think you had the peak of your fame in the 30s and 40s. Particularly like that one of your most prominent films was The Hoodlum Saint.
Yeah, I'm still quite proud of that one.
So remind me to put a link to that one too. I know a lot of your work over the past decade has been in the area of training for high performance, peak performance, particularly in high pressure situations, which I know resus and critical care often are, but also on the journey to becoming an expert and the big ticket items on the road. I know you frequently emphasise the need to think in terms of 4 domains, so yourself, team, environment and patient. And I do think that we have really moved on in terms of the advent of peppering things like deliberate practice, the role of high fidelity simulation. And we've already spoken about human factors and cognitive performance, and these things are definitely filtering into training. I suppose I'm now at the stage post-fellowship where I'm thinking about this ongoing journey. I know you say to mastery. And certainly there's areas of my practice where I feel, particularly in terms of clinical judgment, things deepen and mature. But there's other areas where, I really feel that I might have regressed. And I'm starting to think about professional longevity and how I, continue on this road. And I think there's been some quite divisive conversation about this recently. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that continuing professional development, and what the big ticket items and tools of the trade should be ongoing.
In our own practice to reach mastery?
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm still on that road. I haven't mastered anything yet. So we're all in this together learning.
Good.
But I think you have to put yourself out there. So you have the opportunity when you become a boss to stand back and let other people do everything, which is nice because your trainees need the opportunities to do procedures and lead teams and so on. But there's a critical volume of exposure you need yourself to maintain your skills and to continue to grow. And that's a really hard balance to achieve, I'm not suggesting I have the right balance at the moment, but I actively look for opportunities to get my own hands dirty, for want of a better word. Because, I could easily have not intubated a patient or put a central line in for the last decade and got away with it quite happily. There are other competent people that I could, open quote, be supervising, close quote. And it's easy for someone of my seniority to stand back, but then the rust sets in. And for me, both as a clinician and as an educator, it's really important I don't get rusty for my patient safety, my professional self-esteem, and my credibility as a coach or supervisor or teacher. Yeah. So I have to keep putting myself in the way of sick patients. Ironically, I moved from the UK to Australia, where everyone in the UK seems to have this perception that the Australians are so interventional. They do all their own tubes and lines and everything. They do all this critical care in the ED. But I actually did far more of that stuff in an ED in the UK than anywhere I've worked in Australia, because we were so much busier there with so many more resus patients per doctor. Whereas here, as you know, our EDs are extremely well staffed in comparison. And we have a lot of hospitals for the number of population. Certainly in Sydney, we've got many, 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 many hospitals for the size of population. So many emergency departments, many emergency physicians and registrars sharing the patients. So I've had to actively look for opportunities outside the ED to keep my skills up. So that's why I've got 3 jobs.
Yeah.
So the way I do things isn't necessarily a model to follow. It's just the way I've decided to do things for my own continued growth. But I wouldn't pretend I've achieved optimal sustainability by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I mean, doing 3 jobs in itself is no mean feat. How do you manage the competing responsibilities, and how do you factor in time for your family and for life outside work? And I heard you talking about your emails today and, the barrage of unnecessary ones that you're trying to filter through. How do you juggle these balls?
Well, I've definitely got better at saying no to things, and that's something everyone finds they have to learn at some point in their career. And what I've become better at is mapping requests against what my core goals are. And it sounds a bit selfish, but I get invited to participate in a lot of projects, to do a lot of talks, things like this. And the first question I ask is, does this align with the trajectory that I want? What do I really want to be known for? What do I want to be expert at? And is this really going to make a big difference? Or could someone else be doing just as good a job as me that could take this on? Yeah, with the exception of if my boss says, look, can you just do this? I need you to do it. It doesn't have to align with my goals. I'm being paid to do a job. I'll just do it. But most of the stuff we take on isn't really paid stuff, is it? It's other opportunities. So yeah, I just see if it ticks certain boxes, and if it doesn't, I have to thank someone for the invitation and say no, which probably frustrates a few people. But I can't do everything, and if I help other people with their projects, I don't get to do my own projects. And I've got a lot of things on the back burner that are started and not finished that kind of gnaw away at my consciousness, and I should really be getting on with and finishing.
Yeah. And look, I really admire you, Cliff, because I think you are somebody who walks the talk. And I think that you do push the limits of your own comfort zone when you go to, immerse yourself in experiential learning situations to address things that you personally think might be, weak spots or deficient in your own practice. But I also know that there's going to be a lot of people listening who I think, well, it's really not practical for me to go and do 3 jobs or have a sabbatical in PICU or helicopter retrieval or whatever area of practice it is. We might feel that we're currently stagnating or not maybe getting the exposure that we would like to maintain skills. And I think it's probably not necessary to do all of those things. I know that courses and simulation go a long way to support our ongoing skills maintenance, but we're a wee bit limited with that at the moment because of the pandemic. It's been quite divisive having this conversation, and I think it is something quite threatening. But I think if you feel, if you have a reaction to it, I've said I think this is a good thing because it means you are actually personally reflecting on your practice and ongoing journey professionally. So do you have any practical pearls for people like me?
Yeah, I mean, we have more opportunities nowadays than ever before to, more resources at our disposal to help us train. And I think the first thing is an honest self-appraisal of what your weaknesses are and whether you're committed to addressing them. So let's say you're an emergency physician and you're not hugely confident at intubating children. does that mean you continue to stand back and let someone else do it? Or is this something you're going to tackle? Now, crazy people like me would probably go off and do a fellow job in PICU for 6 months or something, which, I've done in the past. But you don't have to be crazy. You can say to your colleagues, guys, next time we get a kid in the ED that needs to be intubated, can I do the tube? And what I'm going to do in the meantime is I'm going to speak to our friendly anaesthetists and go and do some pediatric ENT lists with them to brush up on my skills. I'm going to attack the YouTube and podcast mediums to see if I can get any other tips. And I might just go and talk to, a friendly pediatric emergency physician, pediatric intensivist, pediatric anaesthetist, or friendly good airway educator and get them to take me through some sims and practice some difficult laryngoscopy drills targeted towards children. And you just build that, that jigsaw picture of skills and knowledge, so that you're ready when the child comes in. You go, hey, this is the one I wanted to do. Do you mind if I step in and do this? But that all comes from an honest self-appraisal about what you think you need and whether you're determined to address it.
And do you think that gets harder the further on you get in your career, to actually step back and, I suppose, this idea of assuming a beginner's mind and be prepared to still be, to be taught?
It might do, but only if ego gets in the way. So I've actually found it easier to be honest about my deficiencies as I've got older, because, I've been around long enough that I couldn't have got this far being completely incompetent. All right. So I must be able to do some things properly, which means if I then speak up about something I want to get better at, people sort of trust me and think, oh, that's fair enough. I'm not walking around telling everyone I don't know how to do anything. Whereas when I was a brand new consultant, I probably would have been very quiet about my deficiencies because I wanted to build that credibility. I wanted to build that trust. But as I've gone on, I've realized people trust you more the more honest you are. Because I'm the guy at the board round, right? We're handing over patients, and someone will come up. Someone will present a patient, and they'll say, so-and-so has come in, 55-year-old with chest pain. He's got a background of, and they'll say some syndrome, right? And everyone will nod, right? And I'll be thinking, I've never heard of that. What's that? Right? Yeah. And they'll finish presenting the patient, and I'll put my hand out and I go, I'm really sorry, but I've never heard of that syndrome. Can someone tell me what that is? And everyone will then look at their shoes and avoid eye contact. And nobody knew what it was, but no one spoke up and asked what it was. But I have to be the dumb one and say, look, I've never heard of that. What is it? And because people know I'll say that, if I tell them I do know something, they'll know I'm not making it up. They'll trust me. So I think that honesty and humility actually builds trust. It doesn't make people lose confidence in you.
So listening to you recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel there's maybe been a few areas of your practice that you have been reflecting on, and you've certainly acknowledged in conversation and in blog posts. And I'd like to explore some of these briefly. Maybe areas where your perspective has been challenged or changed with the passage of time and experience. You did a great podcast on MCRIT with Dr. Scott Weingart on leadership, and I jotted down a few things from that conversation. One of the first was that you acknowledged that as an older white male, you had a privilege in leadership. I wonder at what point you realised this, and has it changed the way that you engage as a leader in your practice with your team?
It's been a gradual realization, I think. Part of it is running resuscitology, this 2-day course where people come along and bring with them cases they found difficult so that we can discuss them in a safe environment. And hearing really good, experienced leaders talk about challenges they've had. And they come in, all genders and shapes and sizes and ethnicities to the course. And they're honest about the challenges that they face. And that really, really got me thinking that actually it's not really appropriate sometimes for me to be considered an authority on resuscitation leadership, because half the work is done for me in terms of being propped up by centuries of cultural bias and the pure randomness of my genetics and geographical heritage. So it's made me listen more, actually, to people that don't look or sound like me, who are great leaders, because they have really, really honed their skills to overcome some of those prejudices and are well worth listening to. So I learn a lot from everybody.
And just on leadership again, and I know you've spoken before that certainly in the most difficult resuscitations or crisis situations, high stakes, a directive and confident leadership style is probably better than a collaborative one. But I did really like that you kind of nuanced that with, at my stage, I do have to now think, listen first as I lead. Could I be wrong before I go down, before I start employing my verbal jiu-jitsu, or before I start, leading my team in a particular direction I think things should go? Is that something that's hard to do on a day-to-day basis? And how does that work in practice for you?
I think everyone in the team's got something to offer. And particularly in simulation, you learn that it's rare for one person to see the full picture, even if they're team leader. And if you actually pause the sim and ask the scribe or the drugs nurse or the intern a question, often they'll have identified something that was important that the team leader didn't know, but they didn't feel empowered to speak up. That's really revealing as a team leader, to think, okay, I'm so fallible and so cognitively and perceptually limited as a human. I need everyone's help to get this right. This is a patient. This is the most important thing. So it's really important to foster that culture of approachability and empower people to speak up. And Chris Nixon does it best. His phrase he uses, and I'm sure he'll forgive me if I've got this wrong, is, okay, team, what am I missing? So rather than say, anyone else got any ideas where people aren't going to feel necessarily ready to speak up? If someone thinks you are missing something, if you ask that specific question, what am I missing? They're almost obliged to answer the question. So I really like that.
Yeah, that's great. And you have introduced the term culture there, because I'm going to quote you now. You said, the older I get, the more I feel culture is everything. And my dad will endlessly quote Drucker on this. How, I know you talk in terms of, self, team, environment, patient. How can we create the best cultures for ourselves, for our colleagues, and for our patients?
This is a huge challenge. So there are places that have evolved a great culture, and it attracts people that want to be part of that, and that reinforces it. And there are other places that have toxic cultures, and even the best people start to modify their behavior to fit into that culture, or they don't survive, which is really sad. And cultural change is one of the hardest things in an organization, because it takes a long time, and sometimes it takes a change of senior staff within the hierarchy, which can be generational. So it's really hard. But as an individual, all you can really do to start with is try and set the tone for when you're around, and hope that there's a critical mass of other individuals that buy into that will do something similar. And it's when it hits critical mass that there's a tipping point, and it accelerates. And I've seen it. I won't name the organizations I've seen it in, but I've seen places get transformed over years, from reasonably toxic to absolutely amazing. What I love about the ED I work in at the moment is it was a brand new hospital and a brand new ED. And so it didn't have a culture to start with. We had to create it from scratch. And so the way we behaved and interacted from day one set the tone. And I'm so lucky to have the staff that I work with, the medical nursing and other staff in that ED. I literally love going to work there. I think it's a great culture. I'm sure it's not perfect, and there'll be people that would listen and go, yeah, but what about ... because nowhere is perfect. But I'm so lucky. It's pretty amazing. Same with Sydney Hems. So lucky to be part of that.
Yeah, but you're contributing to that culture.
Yeah, but there's a critical mass of like-minded people, and not like-minded as in an echo chamber who will want to do the same things the same way. Yeah, we have lots of debates about that. But the point is there's mutual respect and a shared desire to be as good as we can as a team. And I really feel like anything I've done that's perceived as good is really a reflection of the teams and people I've learned from and work with. Just a cog in a machine, really.
I remember you sharing something from one of your mentors, Dr. Mike Clancy, who I was lucky to meet on your courses. He said that when something goes wrong, you have to change something, and that might be yourself, it might be your colleagues, it might be the system. Do you think there's a point at which, when you can't immediately change your environment and surroundings, that you have to vote with your feet?
Yes.
It's hard as a trainee.
Yeah, you have to weigh up the costs. It's an investment. Where you spend your time is an investment, and what sort of returns are you going to get on that investment? So you might decide, man, this place needs fixing. I'm going to stay here and work really hard on the culture, on the systems, create some policies, do some teaching, change the equipment, try and fix it up. But that's a cost that you're choosing to spend. And if it's a part of the world where you think you want to end up working long term as a consultant, then it really might be worth that investment. If it's a place you're rotating through as a trainee, then you've got to ask yourself, am I going to put all this effort in, probably not going to get thanked for it, move on, and I'll be forgotten in 6 months potentially, where people just revert to what they were doing before. Because change requires someone to sort of sustain it. You need champions who are there the whole time, pushing things forward. And it's really hard when you're moving through somewhere to affect change. Everything has a cost. Your time, your energy, your mental and physical health. These are all important, and you've really got to weigh it up. I had some really negative training experiences and some really positive ones. And I actually took a lot from the negative training experiences. And I certainly tried to change my environment that I was in with limited success. I ended up with a reputation that wasn't positive. And it all got quite ugly, actually, at one point. But there was one key senior member who wasn't in emergency medicine but had a role within regional education, who kept telling me, look, I can't change what's happening to you, but I can. I just want you to focus on one thing. The abused will not become the abuser. I want you to repeat that back to me. The abused will not become the abuser. And his point was the way I felt I was being treated as a trainee, I was making a commitment to him that I would never treat my trainees like that. And so that was a hugely powerful learning experience that shaped me, that I wouldn't want to repeat, but I don't regret it because of the impact it's had. So I'm sharing that story because I know there are a lot of disillusioned trainees out there working in environments that maybe aren't supporting them as well as they can. But even the worst things that are happening to them are shaping them, and they can choose how it shapes them. Yeah, if they meet it head on, they'll come away with some bruises and dents. But if they use it as a force to guide them in a particular better direction, they can take something from it.
Thank you for that, because I think that's particularly inspiring coming from someone like you. And there's going to be plenty of people listening to this that will need to hear it. You did talk about affecting change, and we do know that in many areas of our practice it can be very difficult to make things happen on a short-term basis, or certainly quickly. Again, my dear dad with his quotes, he's always quoting somebody or something. Talked about Vladimir Lenin, and there's just this idea of there's decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. And he's like, "Oh, we're seeing that in society at the moment." And I feel that I've seen that quite a lot in medicine, and we have rewritten scripts in several areas, certainly telehealth and just how we design our departments. We're going to have to throw out the textbook there because most of them aren't fit for purpose, we found out. And personal protective equipment. One of the nurses, senior nurses in my department at the moment, we've actually literally knocked walls in our department over the space of a week, and we found all the air was being filtered from our procedure room into our tiny little tea room. So that's all changed. But there was we were moving a cupboard and some compactors. I mean, it was something pretty basic. But she came in and she said, I have been trying for 3 years to get this to happen. Suddenly we get it done in a week. It's quite good to know that we can actually cut some red tape and make things happen quickly, when we need to. But it's just a shame it has to be crisis that makes us do that. If you could harness this time to make some changes, what would you prioritise? What would you like to see happen quicker?
Oh, that's so tough.
Anything in your own kind of work environment or anything?
I think that one of the areas that causes me most pain, and by pain I mean empathy for the patients, is mental health. It's bringing patients with mental health crises to a busy emergency department where they literally can't get the type of care that they need in that environment, I think, despite an amazing mental health team. It just feels wrong, but I don't have a solution because it's an area of medicine that I'm shit at. But if I had a magic wand, it would be providing better services for patients with acute mental health presentations.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think provision of healthcare for our mental health patients and our older patients are big ticket items to really start making change on both short and long term basis. So the only other thing I had written down for this section was something else that I'd heard you speaking about, and you were really emphasising what you felt was the importance to aggressively seek feedback. And certainly we've formalised feedback for training purposes and got quite good at it in formal simulation. But I think generally in clinical practice, it still falls very far short of the mark. And we're more likely to get negative feedback and maybe the odd shit sandwich. Do you have any advice for, particularly in the post-fellowship realm, how we can, constructively seek feedback and apply it personally?
Can you give me an example of a situation that you would want feedback on?
Yeah, so I think I'm meaning generally on my, clinical and professional performance in the workplace, from the perspective of my patients, from my colleagues, what is working well, what could I be doing better. We've recently trialled a 360-degree assessment tool again with the consultants. And, I had a few of these done as a trainee, and I have to say I found them pretty hit and miss.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because feedback is just one word, but it means different things. And I can't remember what that book is that Simon Carley and co recommend. I think it's Thanks for the Feedback, but it talks about 3 different kinds of feedback. And if the person requesting the feedback and the person delivering the feedback aren't on the same page about the type of feedback that's required, it's horrible. And in fact, that happened to me. I was actually in tears as a trainee once, where I'd put my heart and soul into a department worked really hard, really loved being there. I'd looked forward to working there. And it was time for my appraisal, and 3 consultants sat one side of the table. I sat on the other side, and I was expecting a kind of thanks type of feedback. And I got an evaluation that I should be working harder on academic projects, and they were disappointed that I hadn't published much and stuff. And we were completely on different pages about what that appraisal process was meant to be about. And I'm sure in their minds, they were helping me. They probably thought I went in there looking for things that I hadn't done, to get advice on what else I could be doing. But actually, I just wanted them to say, we think you're an okay reg and we appreciate you work hard. And I didn't get any of that. And I went out of there with a mixture of anger, disappointment, frustration, and sadness, to the point where I went back in afterwards and they said, "Oh, we've done you." And I said, "No, I've got something to say. I've worked really hard here and I'm really upset that you haven't told me anything positive." And they looked stunned. They look genuinely bewildered about why I could be so upset. And I really was. I was literally in tears as an adult bloke after that, because I cared so much about my job and my role. So I think the first thing is, be clear on what feedback you're after. You know, is it coaching? Is it an evaluation? Is it some kind of thanks? I can't remember the word that's used in the book for that. That's probably the most important thing that could minimize those difficult scenarios where you're not on the same page.
Reminds me of my music school report card: should take up a musical instrument. That was all that was written 5 years in a row.
Great. So
you mentioned coaching. Sorry, I interrupted you, Karen.
No, that was it really in terms of feedback. I mean, because I've got 3 jobs, I've got imposter syndrome in all 3, because I don't do one thing well. I do 3 things at a sort of average level. And in intensive care, I've got big imposter syndrome, because I've got the UK fellowship, not the Australian fellowship. So I'm surrounded by proper intensivists, and I had really no idea if I was doing a good job or not, because we fly in, fly out. Apart from handovers, that's the only time we interact with another intensivist. So I didn't know if my registrars and residents thought I was good or dumb or anything. I had no idea. So I just designed a Google form and sent it to the nurses and junior medical staff, and told them it was anonymous, which it was, and that the purpose of the form was to tell me where I could be doing better. It wasn't. I didn't want them to tell me I was great. I wanted them to tell me what I could focus on, what were my weak areas, what I could focus on, and that was really helpful. It was, I wasn't as disastrous as I thought I was, and I was happy enough with it to share it with the ICU director. Who said, "That's a good idea. We might get some of your colleagues to do that." So I think you just have to be proactive and be clear on what type of feedback you're after. What's the purpose of the feedback? And most people are happy to give you that when you're clear about your requirements.
Do you have a coach? And do you think coaching is useful?
So I've got an echo coach. That's something I was going to focus on this year, improving my cardiac ultrasound skills. But I've kind of let her down a bit because I've only had 1 session with her and I haven't done my homework. But I decided this year that I probably do need a coach, because that's what I'm missing at the moment. So, when you think about the pursuit of mastery, I do quite a few of the things that we talk about, but I don't actually have coaches. So that's an area of focus for the near future.
Fantastic. So I want to thank you for being very open in this conversation. I think what strikes me is your willingness to be vulnerable, and humility is pretty evident. But look, I do see you as someone who is a game changer in particularly medical education in our specialty. I wondered if you had any predictions about where you think the future, or where the puck will be for medicine and for emergency medicine and critical care in the future.
I don't really want to answer that because I've got no idea. And anyone that tries to predict the future is usually wrong. And it's not like I've got a firm idea that I don't want to share in case I'm wrong. I literally have no idea.
Yeah.
And, but I've been around long enough to consider or to realize that this is now the future that I used to talk about. And I was pretty wrong about that. So,
what is
it's
the most unexpected and surprising about where we are now? And
how
2020.
how similar it all is to how it was. How little has actually changed, which is disappointing. So I've gone through phases, or emergency medicine has gone through phases in the UK and in Australia. And as a trainee, I was immensely frustrated that none of my bosses had critical care skills, and that we were, not allowed to do certain things in the emergency department, which is why I got into trouble sometimes. And I was determined to change that as a boss. And as a boss in the UK, I was with some like-minded colleagues, and we ran a department where we did our own RSI, and we got an ultrasound machine, and we did that, and we'd stick lines in. And we even got to the point where some of the, nurses would do art lines. And I was quite chuffed with that, but that was kind of a golden age for emergency medicine in the UK. It was at the end of this sort of investment in the 4-hour target, which is a tool that can be used for good or evil, but in our particular environment, it was used to get resources and staff and move on those patients that didn't need to be in the ED, so we could do the critical care. And I thought that was the trajectory of UK emergency medicine, and we got some people at the head of the college that shared that vision and introduced competencies in ultrasound and airway management and so on. It was all going in the right direction. That was brilliant. And then I woke up one morning and I was in Australia. And that was purely for my wife's career aspirations. She came out here to do some research, and we ended up staying so she could complete a PhD. And then we had our kid, and we settled. But it was never my plan to desert the UK. I was quite happy there. But we get trainees come to work for us now, 12 years after I left the UK, saying no one in the departments they've come from, no one intubates. They just call ICU, anaesthetist with the tubes. They don't get to do it. They're too busy. So because everyone's getting smashed now, that lack of investment, people don't have the resources or time to do those procedures in some departments. Yeah. But I'm cautious not to tar a whole country with the same brush, because that's the mistake I've accused other people of time and time again. Regionally, it's really variable.
Yeah. I mean, this wasn't my experience, both in UK and Australia, but I certainly hear from trainees rotating from bigger tertiary centres that just the sheer number of both trainees and specialists mean there is a dilution of exposure to resuscitation and procedural skills. How do you think we navigate this?
I mean, the first thing is just being honest about what the patient needs. So, resuscitation is a very small part of emergency medicine, and we need to try and be good at managing the whole department. Mm-hmm. We're lucky in our department. We've got quite a lot of staff specialists, and we've got overlapping but different areas of interest. And so we'll ask each other stuff all the time. So I won't hesitate to call a colleague or go and ask her if she's in the department to help me with a patient who's got, mental health. Presentation is a good example. And similarly, people will sometimes invite me to lend a hand in resus. So that's okay. Emergency medicine is pretty broad. It's quite hard to be expert at every bit of it. The fellowship should make sure we're all at a minimum level of competence in all areas, but we're naturally going to get more expert at the things that we're interested in. And then the other thing to bear in mind is that systems trump individuals. So, we've worked hard making airways safe in our department. So, we should have a safe intubation with a consultant that's only done 100 tubes in critically ill patients. Just as often as if we have a consultant that's done 1,000 tubes, because it's the monitoring, the preparation, and the checklists and the nursing staff that make that whole thing safe. The actual intubation is usually the easy bit.
If it wasn't medicine, what would it be for you?
Time traveler.
So you're going to say astronaut, but yeah, that's pretty good too.
Yeah.
He is an astronaut.
So, well, my plan had been, if I didn't get into medical school, I was going to join the Air Force. I wanted to be a fighter pilot because I was in the Air Cadets.
Yeah.
And I loved that aviation side of thing. And I've sort of gone full circle and ended up back in the sky as a HEMS doctor. So I'm lucky to have that option. That was the plan back then. Probably would have been shot down in the first Gulf War, though. So that's, that was it. But now, if I left medicine now, if I, through some disgraceful act, got struck off and had to find another job, I guess something that involved teamwork and leadership and systems and human factors. So all the training I've done in resuscitation wouldn't be put to waste.
Absolutely. And so this podcast series has interviewed a lot of people that have written books, and I actually think you would write a great one. So no pressure, you've got to get your book out at some point. But certainly I'm an avid reader, and a lot of my reading list has been bolstered by many of your recommendations over the years. So I think, Robert Greene's Thinking the Mastery, and then Thinking Fast and Slow, The Rise of Superman. I read that. I think that was on your recommendation. And I think you might have recommended Chris Hadfield's book to me as well. So have you read anything lately that you can add to my list that's challenged, changed, taught you something? I saw that you read The Secret Barrister, and I've put that on my list. I haven't got there yet. Anything else?
Oh, God, there's so many. I just love books. Oh, and Kindle makes it so easy on my iPhone. And they're so cheap. All right. Well, I'll go through some if you want.
Yeah, great.
Things that have really affected my thinking and sometimes changed my behavior.
Yeah.
Have you read Being Mortal by Atul Gawande?
That's a great one. I'll put that down.
Definitely changed the way
I asked you about coaching, because he got a coach.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But this particular book is about, older people and what's important to them. And as that's the majority of our workload in the ED, it's actually changed the way I interact with my older patients.
So I'm loving having you on the podcast, Cliff, but I'm actually going to have somebody that I hold even in higher esteem. That's on the back of Kelly's podcast last week. So my 92-year-old Nana is going to come on and talk about embracing technology in your 90s.
I can't wait for that. I can't wait.
So I saw I interrupted you. Being
no, that's good. That just changed the way I interact with my mum, with my older patients, and it's a brilliant book. I mean, I can give spoilers for those that haven't read it in terms of how it changed me. But essentially, you should let old people do what they want, rather than be paternalistic and tell them they've failed their safety assessment and they have to be admitted against their will and all that horrible stuff we do to them. If they want to go home and fall over, let them go home and fall over as long as they understand the risks.
Yeah, I agree. I would rather be on my Nana's team than against her.
But she's formidable.
Oh, yes.
What else? Did we talk about the culture code?
No, I've not personally read it, but I'm sure I've come across it at some point.
Daniel Coyle, Coyle. I read that at a good time, just before we moved into our new ED. So all of these principles were in the forefront of my mind when I was interacting with people I work with. So he looked at a number of really high-performing groups of people, whether it was military units, improv comedy groups, successful schools, performance artists, and looked at the common threads, high-performing sports teams, and what did they all have in common? And there are a few key things. So they all, shared a vision that they were subscribed to. They knew what they stood for, what they were about. They all looked, this is a common thread with another book as well, but they all were keen to focus on what they could be doing better. So they were really open and honest about their deficits. They would look at their performance, say, right, okay, what do we do well? What should we do the same next time? Right now, what do we need to change? What can we learn? Which meant they had to be super honest about their deficiencies. And you can only be super honest if you're kind and respectful to each other. And they interacted well. He describes these interactions between people as collisions, where you see it when you're walking around the ED. Yeah, you walk past the wardsman, which is called a porter in the UK, or admin staff, or the cleaner, or any of your colleagues. You say, "Hi, how are you going?" And ask them how they are, and give them a smile, and just be friendly. Just because you can't remember their name or you haven't spoken to them before doesn't mean you look the other way when you walk past them. And you want to increase this number of collisions so that everyone feels part of this wider team. I can't remember any other specific aspects of it, but they all shared this culture. And the other thing was the open vulnerability of the leaders. The leaders would set the tone about being an open and honest about their own deficiencies, their own needs, which again builds trust. So I loved that book. It was great, a really good book. Another book. God, where do we go next? There's just so many great. You tell me to stop because I could keep going on about books.
Keep going. We can't get enough books on this podcast.
So there's another book, right, which is going to prove that a lot of this podcast is made up crap from me. And it's called The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life. Okay, it's by Simler and Hansen. And The Elephant in the Brain, this is, I haven't read it for a while, but essentially, through natural selection, we have evolved to take care of ourselves so that we can perpetuate our genetic line. All right. But if we go around being selfish, we're not going to be liked and we're not going to get anywhere. So we deceive other people into thinking that we're doing things for them as well as for ourselves. All right. But that's not a nice way to behave. So we deceive ourselves as well. So people believe us because we're not actually lying or being dishonest because we don't know about our own hidden motives. And it cites a lot of the psychological research to support this, how we do a lot of post hoc rationalization about our decisions and our behaviors. So you've asked me a lot today about why I've done things and why I did this and why did I do that? And I've given you a narrative that I believe, but I have no idea why I've done anything in my life. It's my brain has just done it. And then my consciousness at some point has found reasons that I'm comfortable with that allows me to maintain some coherent sense of self and identity. But it's probably all bollocks. So that's a great book, and it makes you second guess yourself the whole time. Like you do something nice with someone, you think, did I really want to be nice? Or on some level, is that self-serving? I don't know. Should I counter that by trying to be more nice, or should I just stop bother being nice? Like you can go mad reading this stuff, but motives behind human behavior are really interesting. Really interesting. Anything by Yuval Noah Harari, I love. So he wrote the book Sapiens, which was a New York Times bestseller.
I was actually reading an article that referenced that book this morning. Very timely.
So he is a historian from Israel, who's a great writer, and his historical perspective on human society gives him this, unique way of commenting on the present day and what's going on in the world. He's written 3 books that I'm aware of. I've read all of them, but Sapiens was the original, and it's absolutely fascinating. Once again, why we do the things we do, really fascinating to me.
And will you write a book?
Well, it's funny because I've been thinking about doing a PhD, and I've been speaking to a few people with PhDs, and weighing up whether it's something I really should commit to, because I'm under no illusions of the amount of time and effort, because my wife did one. And someone very wise a friend and colleague said, "Why don't you write a book?" Like she said, "No one's going to read your PhD. Lots of people will read your book."
I have to agree there. Yeah.
So
I suspect you'll do both, but I do have to agree.
I sort of feel like I don't deserve to write a book unless I've got a PhD.
I also knew you were going to say that.
Like, buy my book because I've got a PhD on this stuff. That makes more sense to me rather than, oh, I'm going off on something again. Read what I've written down. Well, you're the second person that's told me to write a book. All right, so if more people tell me to, it might sway me away from the PhD.
Okay, I reckon I've got room for one more.
Tegmark is an author I really like. He's a physicist, and he wrote a book called Life 3.0, Being Human in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And I would say, even if you're not going to read the whole book, read the opening chapter, which is it's a story he's written in the near future about how an AI gets out of control, and it's very plausible. And the rest of the book is nonfiction about AI and the pros and cons. But it's powerful stuff, really powerful stuff.
Great, thank you. My book list is replete. I think I'll probably go for the culture code first.
Yeah, that would be at the top of my list.
So just finally, I think of you as someone who's very invested in the trainee's journey. And I said at the beginning of this podcast that you were someone who influenced me, significantly as a trainee. Aware that process is challenging enough, but this year in particular and the pandemic has really added to the pressures. Do you have any messages for our trainees at this time?
There are a lot of demands on people and trainees, and there are social media personalities, and I could probably be included in that, that might give the impression that you need to be achieving levels of either currency or procedural expertise that are out of your reach, either at the moment or will be out of the reach for a while. So, the thing we don't talk about much is that none of us is perfect at any of this stuff, and no one is truly up to date in everything. So just be kind to yourself and be realistic. Don't try and read all the journals and all the blogs and listen to all the podcasts, because life isn't fun when you're trying to do all that. Have some fun, and then choose 2 or 3 resources that you find fit in with the way you like to learn. And you don't have to be aware of what's in the New England Journal this week. If it's something practice changing, it will find its way to you. Don't stress over it. I'm partly talking to myself here, but it's easy to feel like everyone else is up to date, and if you're not aware of something, you're dumb, you're not reading the journals. But no one is up to date. Everyone's missing something. Choose a few secondary evidence sources, or a podcast or 2 that you find helpful, and fit it into the drive to work or the run or whatever. But just don't stress over it. You work hard enough anyway. Just be kind to yourself.
Perfect. So, a few personal questions, if I may. What does good health mean to you? This podcast does have a health and well-being focus too. So personally,
good health to me means I have the capacity to enjoy a moment without distraction. So if I'm not mentally preoccupied with something that's making me sad or anxious, and I'm not physically preoccupied with feeling unfit or in pain, then I have good health. If you can cry with laughter, you're probably in good health. So aiming for those moments is good. And I sometimes, this is going to sound a bit weird, but sometimes I feel like I'm kind of outside myself watching me in my life. And that's at moments where my wife and I call them spots of life. And it could be anything from just watching a lovely sunset to listening to my son explain a basketball move to me, and just watching his mouth move and his bright eyes and his enthusiasm. It's being able to be in the moment with stuff like that and really appreciate it, to be undistracted. That's an example of good health, because when you're not healthy, you can't appreciate those moments, and life's too short and those moments are gone. So those spots of life, I guess, if someone was making a cheesy movie and you were looking back at all those precious moments you spent with someone, it would be those scenes that you would select for that montage. We should look out for those spots of life and appreciate them before they're gone.
Gold. And I really loved your tweet this morning that although it's probably not really allowed in a pandemic, but you really feel people aren't tickling each other enough. I thought that was magic.
Do you know what? I've had 2 occasions in the last couple of months where I've woken up laughing in the night, and my wife has said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I dreamt I was being tickled." And like my ribs were really tickly, and it was making me laugh in my sleep. In my dream, I was laughing, and then I'd laugh out loud, and the laughing would wake me up. Yeah, one of them was just randomly my colleague Tatiana at the hospital, one of the other emergency physicians. She was tickling me in my dream, and I told her she knows this, and she's weird enough to appreciate it. And she's never really tickled me for real, but that doesn't matter. It's great to wake up feeling like that. And that's probably a reflection at the time of just being really happy at work and just feeling good about my circumstances there. So you either get tickled or dream of being tickled. But tickling's just great.
Yeah, I have that dream where my teeth all disintegrate. I need to change my dreams.
Yeah, I've had that one. That's common, right? The teeth falling out. Yeah, that's a common dream.
Yeah, so it's a control thing, I think. Do you have any go-to strategies or techniques in your emergency self-care toolkit when things are personally challenging or in times of adversity? A quick check.
Yeah, I do a lot of self-talk. So when things are really challenging, it's, I guess I remind myself of my responsibilities and who's relying on me and what's expected of me. So when the pandemic started, that was terrifying for everyone. I was pretty convinced I was going to die or might die and had to be prepared. I thought society was going to break down. I'd need to protect my family. All these crazy thoughts that I thought only I was thinking, but actually talking to a few friends, I wasn't the only one. I became really preoccupied with that. And that was a stressful time. And even though we've escaped the pandemic largely in hospitals in New South Wales, mentally we faced it. We were preparing for it like we've not prepared for anything else ever in the past. It was all consuming. But yeah, what is expected of me is a good question. And amazing experience recently of a nurse I work with who came across a nasty crash miles from the hospital, miles from the city actually, and stopped to help and had a number of critically injured casualties. Did an amazing job of fashioning some windlass tourniquets to stop the exsanguination from bilateral amputations on a guy and saved his life. And that was just one of the patients she looked after. And I said, yeah, how did you pull it all together? I have the wherewithal to do that. I'm not even sure I would have thought of doing what you did, to be honest. It was amazing. And she said, I just kept asking myself, what would Cliff and the team expect of me? And I nearly fell off my chair when she said it. Like, yeah. So, and I guess that comes back to the culture thing. She thought about the team we work in and what we would expect of her, which, well, I mean, she performed way beyond what we'd expect of anybody, more than I would expect of myself. She was incredible. But I love that. So yeah, what is expected of me is a good question.
Yeah, I love that. So finally, I've been asking people to describe their ideal, I suppose it's a Sunday soul session or self-care Sunday, although I'm quite aware I've interviewed so many shift workers that, self-care Sundays might well fall on the midweek shift workers weekend. But if you could design an ideal day for yourself, what would you do and who would you take with you?
Ideally, the day starts with vigorous physical exercise, because then everything else just seems to work, doesn't it? But something involving not just cardiovascular activity, but a flow state. So, jiu-jitsu grappling would be a good example. It has everything, and you cannot be more in the moment than when someone stronger and younger and heavier than you is on you, and you're having trouble breathing. That's there's nothing else in the world at that moment other than that grappling experience. So that's a flow state. That's great, and it's so invigorating. And the camaraderie in a jiu-jitsu club's great too. So you would great.
So do you still practice regularly?
Yeah. But not as much as I would like, because I have not achieved balance in all of my competing interests. But that's starting a day with jiu-jitsu would be great. And an activity that's involving learning and improving. And again, jiu-jitsu ticks that box too. And then the wind down afterwards involves, being with people you love, whether it's friends or family. In my case, spending some time with my wife and son is always a treat, for me, not for them. And doing something absorbing with my son would be good. He's 10 now. I'll be 11 in November, and I dread the day when he doesn't enjoy playing with me. I can't be that far off now.
No, that's never going to happen.
But at the moment we can have some fun together. It could be really absorbing as well. And then, maybe cooking a meal together, maybe a traditional roast dinner or something, and having that with wider family or friends over and having a chat, drinking wine. If the sun is shining, that's a bonus. That I've just described the perfect day, actually. Right?
Yeah, take me with you. Although I probably would run up a mountain in the morning.
Cool. Oh, and then reading comics.
Thank you.
Chilling out, reading comics.
Perfect. Actually, you've made it when you actually feature in a comic. You haven't featured in one yet, have you? Or have you?
Don't think so. No, I don't know what role I would have in a comic. That'd be interesting.
Somebody else I was listening to. Oh, I think it was Joe Wick's podcast, and he had featured in the Beano. It's like you've made it when you feature in the Beano.
That's great.
So you can put that on your list. You have just been listening to the wisdom and good humour, the brilliant medical mind that is Dr. Cliff Reid. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I know I certainly did. And I think clinicians and non-clinicians alike will find something valuable and really practical to take back from our conversation today. I just wanted to leave you with something that Cliff himself shared not that long ago. And I think it really reflects the man himself. There are people who make things happen. There are people who watch things happen. And there are people who wondered what happened. To be successful, you need to be the person who makes things happen. And that was by late great Apollo astronaut Jim Lovell. I look forward to joining you next time on the Mindful Medic podcast. Thanks for listening.
That's nice. That's the biggest compliment you can pay me, is to use the word inspire. I told my wife that's what I want written on my tombstone, because I've been inspired by others, and I'm so grateful for that inspiration. To be able to pay it back or pay it forward, whatever the term is a privilege.
The MBA New South Wales ACT does wonderful work for those of our colleagues who are at this very minute experiencing a hard time. One way you can show you care about doctors' welfare is to go to their website, www.mbansw.org.au, and donate today. Knowing that their colleagues' care is a big part of these doctors' recovery, so please be part of the solution. All donations are tax deductible. If you can, please consider a monthly donation, as even small amounts collectively will allow them to plan their growth to support the increased demand.